The morning fog curled low over the hills of northern Montana, thick and pale like breath on cold glass. The air smelled of pine needles and melting frost, and not even the birds dared break the silence. Riley Holt had just stepped out of her cabin, coffee mug in hand, when she froze. Her boots crunched softly against the wood of the porch. The steam from her cup rose slowly, but her breath stopped altogether. At the edge of the clearing, half shrouded in mist, stood a figure she hadn't seen in over a year. Broad shoulders, muscular frame, ears tipped with black, and those eyes golden, focused, and impossibly familiar. It was him. The Bobcat she had once carried in her arms, no heavier than a loaf of bread. The one she'd fed by syringe, bathed with a warm cloth, and cried beside on more nights than she could count. He had come back. No GPS, no collar, no enclosure. Just instinct and maybe something more. Riley didn't move, didn't call his name. She knew better. Wild animals don't belong to us. They come back only if they choose to. And this one, she had named him Echo, was the last creature she ever expected to see again. But here he was, alive, massive, and walking slowly toward her through the fog, just like he used to, when he was still small enough to sleep curled against her chest. She blinked, but the vision didn't vanish. His paws pressed gently into the damp earth, each step deliberate. No fear, no hesitation, just presence. The wind shifted. Riley held her breath, and then he stopped. Right there, just a few feet from the porch. His head tilted, ears alert. Their eyes met, not like strangers. Like something older, deeper, as if time itself had bent to bring this moment back to her. And in that instant, Riley knew, the bond they had forged in pain and silence hadn't broken with distance. It had only grown roots, and now they were blooming. When Marlene stepped into the ranger station, the room was quiet, too quiet for something still clinging to life. One of the guards pointed to a corner, his face pale. "There," he said. "We found him beside his mother's body. He hasn't moved in hours." A cardboard box sat beneath a desk, lined with old towels and still damp from melting ice. Inside, curled like a fallen leaf, was a bobcat cub no bigger than a house cat. His fur was patchy, his ribs were showing, his ears drooped like wilted flowers. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and wet wool. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a cold glow over the tiny body that looked more like a stuffed toy than a living creature. Marlene knelt down slowly, not wanting to startle him. But he didn't flinch, he didn't growl, he didn't move. Only his eyes blinked, slow and hollow, as if life were already halfway gone. Her heart clenched. She had seen injured animals before, broken wings, gunshot wounds, even snared limbs. But this was different. This was absence. As if his spirit had gone quiet. "What's his name?" she asked, her voice low. "He doesn't have one," said the ranger. "Didn't think he'd make it through the night." She reached out and gently placed her hand on the edge of the box. "You're wrong," she whispered. "He's still here." And that's when she gave him a name. Not something fierce or wild, but something soft. Theo. That night, she didn't go home, she stayed. She made a nest of warm blankets in a storage room, pushed a heater close, and laid beside the box. Every 2 hours, she fed him warm formula with a syringe. When he couldn't lift his head, she lifted it for him. When he wouldn't close his eyes, she hummed softly until he did. She barely slept, her body ached, but she didn't leave his side. She whispered to him between feedings, stories of meadows and rivers and quiet dawns. Not because he understood, but because she needed to believe he could hear. For 3 nights, he didn't move. But on the 4th, as she reached to feed him, he placed one weak paw on her wrist. It was barely a touch, but it was everything. Like a single match struck in the dark. And in that tiny gesture, Marlene felt it, a thread pulling taut between them, not of ownership, but of recognition. The days blurred together after that, Marlene barely noticed time passing. She ate granola bars from her bag, slept on folded towels, and refused to leave Theo's side. The ranger station felt less like a workplace and more like a sanctuary carved out by necessity. The world outside kept moving, reports filed, patrols made, but for her, life had narrowed to the quiet rhythm of one fragile heartbeat. Theo was still fragile, but something had shifted. Each time she opened the enclosure, his ears flicked slightly. His gaze tracked her movements, no longer vacant, but alive with the faint flicker of recognition. He began watching her, not with fear, but with curiosity, as though trying to remember what safety had once felt like. And then, one afternoon, it happened. As she leaned over to change the blanket, stiff from dried formula and fur, Theo crawled forward, just a few shaky steps. His paws trembled with effort, claws catching slightly on the towel. Then he pressed his head, gently but deliberately, against her forearm. It wasn't a nuzzle. It was more like permission. Marlene froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she sank down beside him, folding her legs and letting him lean into her warmth. She didn't speak, didn't pet him, just stayed. Her stillness was the answer to his question. Am I safe here? That night, for the first time in a week, she opened her weathered notebook and scribbled a single line. He chose to try. From that point on, Theo began rebuilding himself. It started with the smallest things. Lapping water without help, sniffing the edge of her backpack, swiping at a loose thread on the blanket, trying to stand without collapsing. Every tiny victory felt like a miracle. By week 2, he was following her voice, slowly, awkwardly, like a child learning balance. By week 3, he would press his tiny paws against the wire mesh when he saw her coming, letting out a soft chirp that wasn't quite a meow, but close enough to melt her heart. The bobcat who once lay waiting for death now greeted her with the hope of each sunrise. The rangers called it strange. Some even whispered that she was wasting her time, but Marlene called it sacred, because she knew what it meant for a wild animal to trust a human. It wasn't taming, it was something deeper, something earned through presence, pain, and patience. By the time the leaves began to yellow, Theo had doubled in size. His fur had grown thick and warm, mottled with rich earth tones and faint spots that shimmered in sunlight. His eyes, once dull and sunken, now burned with alertness. He no longer moved like something broken. He stalked, leapt, climbed, a creature reclaiming what had once been stolen. Marlene built a small outdoor enclosure beside the ranger station. It wasn't much, just a fenced patch of grass with logs and branches for enrichment, but it gave Theo something he hadn't had since birth: space. Space to stretch, to test, to remember what it meant to be wild. She sat with him every morning, coffee in hand, scribbling in her notebook, while he darted between shrubs or pounced on leaves that dared to move. Sometimes he'd pause and look at her, really look, and something would pass between them, a stillness, a knowing. He was growing stronger, and she was running out of time. The question everyone began to ask, even the ones who had stopped believing in his survival, was inevitable. When will you release him? The answer knotted her stomach every time. She had trained for this. Rehabilitation meant letting go. Wild meant freedom. Love, in this job, meant walking away. But logic never held a baby bobcat in the dead of night, whispering lullabies to keep him breathing. Logic didn't feel the small weight of a paw resting on a wrist after days of silence. Logic didn't weep when that same paw grew claws strong enough to climb trees again. Marley knew the signs. He no longer cried when she left. He growled when strangers passed her close. He preferred the rustle of wind to the sound of her voice. He was remembering. He was almost ready. And every time he pulled away, every time he flinched at her touch, hissed at a noise in the distance, a part of her heart cracked, not from pain, but pride. Because it meant she had done it right. Because it meant he was going home. The morning of the release came sooner than she wanted. The sky was overcast, thick with grey clouds that seemed to know what the day meant. The wind carried the scent of rain, pine, and something else, something restless. Theo paced the edges of the enclosure, no longer frail, no longer hesitant. His shoulders moved with purpose now, and when he stopped to look at her, there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, readiness. Marlene stood by the gate, fingers trembling around the latch. 4 weeks, she had prepared for this moment, filled out forms, coordinated with the wildlife team, even scouted the safest release zone in the nearby preserve. She had done everything right. And yet, nothing felt right. Theo approached slowly. Not out of fear, but calm, as if he understood. As if he'd known all along that this was never meant to be permanent. She crouched to meet his gaze one last time. "You're not mine," she whispered, voice thick. "But I'll always be yours." His nose touched her knee, barely a brush, and then he stepped back. One paw lifted, then another. Marlene opened the gate. Theo paused, his silhouette framed in the open space between fence and forest. The world beyond was wild, vast, dangerous, yes, but also his. She didn't call after him, didn't beg him to turn back. He didn't look over his shoulder, but as he reached the edge of the trees, he stopped, just for a breath, and turned his head slightly. His eyes met hers, a second, maybe less, then he was gone. Marlene stood there long after he disappeared, not crying, not breaking, just quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when you've given everything you had, and it was enough. She returned to the cabin with empty arms and full memory, and that night, for the first time since she'd found him, she slept through until morning. The cabin felt different without him. It wasn't just the silence. Marlene had known quiet all her life. But this was something else, an absence that hummed. The kind of stillness that made clocks seem louder, floors colder, rooms wider than they really were. She tried to go back to normal. Cleaned out the supply bin, folded the worn towels, boxed up the empty syringes and leftover formula. Each item felt like a thread she had to cut, and still, when she passed the storage room, she paused. Just for a second, just in case. Days passed. Then a week, then 2. The Rangers stopped asking. Her colleagues stopped bringing it up. To them, it was over, mission complete. The cub had survived. He was back in the wild where he belonged. But belonging, Marlene realized, wasn't only about habitat. It was about connection. And you don't unfeel something just because it's gone. One evening, she sat on the porch with a mug of tea gone cold. The sun dipped low, painting the distant ridge in orange and rose. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup absent-mindedly. She wasn't expecting anything. She'd stopped expecting. But then, a sound, barely audible, a rustle just beyond the edge of the clearing. Too big to be a bird, too soft to be the wind. She stood slowly, nothing, still. Something tugged at her chest. Not memory, not hope, just ... A pull. Later that night, she found it by the tree line. A small, clean mark in the soil. A paw print, too big for a house cat, too precise for coincidence. Right at the place where the trees met the edge of her world. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't have to. Theo had been there. Not to stay, not to be seen, just to say, he remembered. The next few weeks passed with the slow rhythm of late summer. Marlene went back to her usual tasks at the station, trail inspections, wildlife reports, early morning patrols. Her body moved through the motions, but her mind, it wandered. Every time she passed the edge of the clearing, her eyes searched without meaning to. Not because she expected to see Theo again, but because she wasn't sure she hadn't. Some mornings, she found tufts of fur caught in low branches. Once, a half-eaten rabbit just outside the property line, too cleanly dissected for a coyote, too fresh for a scavenger. Another time, paw prints along the riverbank, always just far enough to doubt, just close enough to believe. She never told the others. They wouldn't understand that sometimes not seeing is the real gift, that presence doesn't always come in form, that knowing someone made it, that he's alive, thriving, remembering, is more than enough. And yet, one evening, it happened. Marlene was walking the lower ridge trail, flashlight in hand, when she heard it. A sound behind her, a low shuffle. No growl, no panic, just breath and brush. She turned slowly, and there, standing between the trees, was Theo, not a cub anymore. He was magnificent, muscular, tail high, eyes sharp. And yet, the way he tilted his head, just slightly, that was him. Still him. She didn't move, neither did he. Then, with a single blink, slow and deliberate, Theo turned and melted back into the forest, as quiet as he had come. No drama, no rush, because wild things don't say goodbye. They just remind you they were real. Autumn crept in quietly. The trees along the ridge turned copper and gold, and the wind carried the scent of dried leaves and cold soil. Marlene returned to her rhythm, but it wasn't the same rhythm as before. Something had changed. Or maybe she had. The cot in the back room, where she had slept beside Theo's box, was still there. She couldn't bring herself to move it. His blanket, folded neatly, still smelled faintly of milk and pine. The notebook where she had tracked every feeding, every shift in temperature, every moment of doubt, lay open on the same page. He chose to try. It had been months since she'd last seen him. And yet, he was everywhere, in the silence between footsteps on a forest trail, in the sound of rain tapping on the ranger station roof, in the way she found herself pausing before entering a clearing, just in case. She started speaking at schools again, not just about wildlife safety or conservation, but about connection, about how sometimes saving a life isn't about cages or collars, it's about bearing witness, about not walking away. She never used his name, never showed pictures. She didn't need to, because what Theo had taught her wasn't something to be displayed. It was something to be carried. That bond, brief, wordless, wild, had carved something in her, something permanent. And every now and then, as the first snow began to fall across the northern Montana hills, she would glance toward the trees and wonder, was he watching? Did he remember? She hoped not. She hoped he had forgotten everything, except what it felt like to live. The first real snow came early that year. Marlene had just closed the ranger station for the evening when she heard it, faint, sharp, and carried on the wind like a thread pulled too tight. A sound she hadn't heard in months, not a howl, not a growl. A cry, young, urgent. She stepped outside, heart already racing, and scanned the trees. Silence. Then again, the cry. She didn't think. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, boots crunching over the fresh snow as she made her way toward the sound. The wind bit her cheeks, but she didn't slow down. Past the birch grove, down the slope behind the old elk blind, toward the edge of the frozen stream. There, beside a fallen log, was a shape, small, trembling, fur dusted in frost. At first she thought it was a fox, but as she knelt, her breath caught. It was a bobcat cub, alone. Its ears were tipped with black, its eyes wide, golden, familiar. But not Theo. This one was smaller, younger, lost, and limping. Marlene didn't move closer. She crouched in the snow and waited. The cub stared back at her, shivering, breathing fast. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak. And then behind her a low rustle, a heavier shape stepped out from the trees. She turned slowly, and her heart nearly stopped. It was him, larger now, muscular, scars along his left side, a deep golden stare that hadn't changed. Theo. He stood still, watching her. Not fearful, not aggressive, just present. The cub let out a cry again, this time toward Theo, and Theo moved closer, nudged the smaller one with his head, then looked at Marlene, not for help, for trust. Marlene didn't move. Theo stood between her and the cub, not as a shield, but as a bridge. His body relaxed, his tail swayed low, slow. He looked at her, then at the little one, then back again. And she understood. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reunion. Slowly, she removed her gloves and crouched in the snow, letting her hands rest on her knees. The cub, hesitant but watching, took a step forward, then another. Theo didn't stop him. He stayed close, but didn't interfere. The cub reached her boots, sniffed, whimpered. Marlene blinked back tears. She opened her coat slightly, letting the heat from her body reach out. The cub leaned into it, just a little, enough, and Theo. He sat down in the snow beside them, not touching, not crowding. Just there, that night. She didn't bring them inside. Instead, she brought out blankets, a heater, and a pot of stew she had made earlier. She placed everything near the shed and left the door open. No cages, no crates, just space, choice. Theo ate. The cub curled beside him, and Marlene. She sat on the porch, wrapped in wool and wonder, watching them through the falling snow. By morning, they were still there, and over the weeks that followed, something new began. Not ownership, not domestication, but understanding, a rhythm. Some nights, they stayed near. Other days, they vanished into the trees, but they always came back. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. And years later, when hikers would ask Marlene about the two bobcats that sometimes appeared near the ranger station, one large and scarred, the other young and swift, she would smile, tuck her journal under her arm, and simply say, "Some wild hearts don't run away, they find their way back." If this story moved you, you're not alone. The bond between humans and wild animals is rare and unforgettable. Subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. And if you've ever loved an animal who changed your life, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story.